This is Desalini. Welcome to episode 8 of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Let's go. So yeah, at this point we're kind of on our timeline. We're looking at 1992, kind of going into 93. And while we've been focusing on kind of some of the more shoegazy elements, I think this is the point where that whole movement started to kind of morph into something different. So bands like Ride or Catherine Wheel or Lush, the Pale Saints, they were all releasing second albums, or in some cases their first albums, but their sounds were developing in different ways from those early EPs that they really kind of made their names with. And there were other kind of bands kind of snapping at their heels, if you like, who were maybe taking the sound in slightly different directions again. I'm thinking of bands like the Boo Radleys or the Verve, who were kind of going in a slightly more psychedelic, explicitly kind of psychedelic direction, but still using a similar kind of sound palette to what the shoegaze bands of that time were using. One interesting band of that time as well would be Adorable, and they were explicitly going far bigger, far poppier, far more brash than a lot of the shoegaze bands. You know, there was very little looking at one's shoes with Adorable. They were definitely looking for a bigger audience and were quite happy to kind of push themselves out there. And I think that was kind of an indication of where a lot of UK indie bands would go with Britpop, you know, pushing the attitude and the kind of the image a lot more. Possibly at the expense of the music, I'm not sure, but there was a core of bands emerging at this time who were, I think, taking some of the lessons of shoegaze and taking some of those sounds that influenced shoegaze from chiefly, I guess, the late kind of 80s American underground scene. I think it's fair to say shoegaze leaned quite heavily on bands like Sonic Youth and Dinosaur Jr. and even Husker Du, but we're doing something a little different with it. And I think we would now start to see in 1992 a group of bands emerging who were doing something even more different again. So first up today, I'd like to talk about Moonshake and their Eva Luna album from October of 1992. So Moonshake, this would actually be their only full-length album with their kind of original lineup. They did release an EP shortly before this album, which was firmly, I think, in the kind of shoegaze territory. But there were signs on that record that they had influences far beyond that they were looking to push. And it was, they were a band which was a kind of a classic example of having two songwriters in it. So different styles, different vocal styles, different writing styles, different lyrical approaches, which I think initially helped the band a great deal. It gave them an edge, and it gave them a kind of a uniqueness that maybe just having a single voice leading everything would have given them. But I think that there was a tension there, and that would eventually come to kind of split the band in two shortly after the follow-up kind of EP to this album. But I think this album catches them at their kind of absolute peak. The two songwriters I'm talking about are Dave Callahan and Margaret Fiedler. Again, very different styles. Fiedler has a kind of softer, more lilting, almost folky kind of style to her vocal delivery, whereas Dave Callahan, who'd been in the C86 kind of era indie band, the Wolfhounds, had a much more kind of sneering, declamatory, kind of small p political lyrical kind of associations, but definitely harder and more in your face. And Fiedler's lyrical concerns were always a lot more kind of personal, but with a big P. So, traumas writ large via the textures in the music. So the sound of Moonshake is very, very rich. They were one of this generation of bands who were using samplers a lot to add that richness, to add layers and layers of sounds, building up a kind of a collage type feel. It could be musical sounds or it could be found kind of environmental sounds. But they would use things like lots of flutes, lots of odd percussion, anything really. And it's all kind of atop this rhythmic background of a rolling, kind of almost percussive, krautrock influenced drumming style with very heavy kind of dub style bass. If you're looking for a kind of an immediate post-punk kind of precedent, then there are strong echoes of Public Image Limited here, circa the Metal Box album. But their sound is just kind of crammed with all this clattering, cacophonous kind of detail. There's very little kind of dreaminess going on here. So that element of shoegaze, they just kind of pushed away. And this was much kind of more angry, vibrant, pushy music. So if we're going to talk about some key tracks, you really have to identify which ones were sung and written by Dave Callahan and which was sung and written by Margaret Fiedler. I think the track Tar Baby is a really good example of Margaret Fiedler's vocal style. It's this almost whispered, low-key, folky stuff, but this kind of writhing, rhythmic stew underneath it with explosions of dissonant sonic youth style guitar noise. Very unsettling, but really quite a cool sound. She employs a similar kind of vocal style on the track Bleach and Salt Water. But here the rhythms, they kind of form into almost a Latin kind of thing. It's very odd. It's very kind of groovy, very, very kind of Latin funky, but still with this cacophonous kind of sound collage approach on top of it. And it's quite telling because this style would be this kind of almost Latin kind of style of rhythm, almost kind of a Tropicalia type approach, would form the heart of Fiedler's band, which she formed following Moonshake's initial kind of break. And that band was called Leica. So accommodating the two songwriters' styles, I think the tension is visible everywhere, even in the artwork of the album, which is, again, chaotic, piecemeal, but kind of more than the sum of its parts. And the music itself, even when Fiedler is singing in a kind of slightly softer, more lilting fashion, is, as I said before, not dreamy, not floaty. This is very urban sounding music. It feels grimy and paranoid and on the edge of hysteria. In the case of Dave Callahan, the vocals even get kind of quite hectoring, quite up in your face, as if you're being accosted by someone who's trying to get something really important across. And I think that comes across best in the song which is at the heart of the album, City Poison, which has got this amazingly propulsive kind of dub bass line that just pulses and drags the song forward. And you get this great lyrical conceit from Dave Callahan, talking about how cities just are full of poison, but maybe not in the way you realise. He sings, "With your artificial prices and fashionable beers, you bring your city poison round here." So he's kind of showing some quite ugly kind of urban attitudes. But the song itself has just got this spiralling kind of beautiful guitar figure at the heart of it as well. I think I've mentioned Pill already. it puts me in mind of their classic song, Pop Tones. But yeah, this is a very direct, almost political kind of song. Another Dave Callahan song that kind of closes the album is Mugshot Heroin, which is quite incredible. It sounds like this almost kind of cacophonous post-punk cover version of the main theme from Taxi Driver, Bernard Herrmann's orchestral theme from Taxi Driver, this kind of jazzy, squawking brass with these sax kind of stabs breaking in, these soaring sampled string sounds which kind of sound like sirens, and this kind of almost this Middle Eastern beat or a melody kind of underpinning the whole thing. You really get the feel of a multicultural melting pot of being at the heart of this metropolis that is just full of the music and the sounds of different cultures all just clashing and rubbing up against each other. And yeah, the vocal itself is just utterly seething with anger and frustration. It's quite an overwhelming closer to the album. So onto the second album today, and I'd like to talk about Under My Skin, I Am Laughing by Earwig. Don't have a precise date for this, but it was definitely released in 1992. So Earwig were a three-piece hailing from the Brighton kind of Hove area of the UK. They formed in 1989, consisting of Kirsty, Julian and Dimitri. Kirsty was the singer, playing bass as well, and Julian and Dimitri shared guitar and programming duties. The programming in this case being synthesized sounds and the sampler that was the heart of their sound. This was quite a change for them following their first two EPs, which were kind of quite standard indie sounding guitar pop sounds of the day, quite scratchy. Yeah, I think the Shop Assistants, possibly the Wedding Present, even a little bit of the Darling Buds, early Darling Buds might fit appropriately there. But there were definitely signs on the second EP that they were kind of they'd been listening to some of the same music that had been inspiring the shoegaze bands. But then, yeah, as I've hinted, something happened when they got their hands on a sampler. And they discovered the joy of minimalism. So minimalism is something that shoegaze was most definitely not about. But Earwig were clearly synthesizing some different influences. Stuff like modern classical music. I'm thinking here about the kind of repetitive, loopy, by which I mean kind of tape loops, a kind of modular, repeating classical music that you might get from a composer like Philip Glass or Steve Reich. And I think there's even traces on this album as well of some of the sounds of Brian Eno's kind of systems music, circa kind of the Discrete Music album that he released, which is this idea of kind of an evolving kind of process-driven creation of music, where you kind of set the parameters and let it go. I'm not saying that that's what Earwig were doing, but certainly the structures that they were using and the way they were writing gives the feel of that kind of music. It's very, very interesting. Just to divert into the whole issue of samplers, because I've already mentioned that with Moonshake, and it came up when we talked about the Young Gods in an earlier episode. I think the real explosion of people using samplers at this time was, well, it was one, the visibility. They were present on lots of the early hip-hop records that were kind of breaking through into people's consciousness kind of late 80s. And they just got cheaper. Yeah, this was no longer the days of you had to spend the same as you would for a small family car to buy a Fairlight. You could buy these kind of small devices for your studio, like the Emu sampler or some of the Akai samplers, and you could get to work with it for relatively small amounts of money. So sampling was pretty high in the kind of public consciousness at that time, due to the hip hop records of the days, the early Public Enemy records, for instance. Songs like "Pump Up the Volume" by Mars, even like a few years before, Paul Hardcastle's 19, that was a huge hit. And it just brought the idea of found sound and sampling and repurposing things into the mainstream initially. And as it became more affordable, indie bands and similarly adventurous kind of artists were using samplers for the first time and finding some quite interesting ways to write music with them. So I talked about the influence of modern classical music and even hints of like systems music. Nowhere is that more apparent than on the first track of this album, called "Everyday Shines." It's replete with all these elements. It has these circling kind of simple motifs, which kind of seem to evolve over time. New elements are introduced gradually. They push the song in kind of new directions. And these kind of bare upfront vocals, they're soft, they're breathy. It's kind of like that dreaminess that you had in Shoegaze, but with this strange synthetic backing. And it's only towards the end of this song that it evolves to the point where you do get this distorted, collapsing, almost kind of gliding guitar noise that overtakes it. Glide being kind of this style of guitar playing that was developed by Kevin Shields of My Bloody Valentine. You hear a little of that, but only towards the end. There are no drums on this song. It's very cool. It's about 10 minutes long. And it doesn't sound like shoegaze. No siree. In fact, I think this is probably the point where we can start seriously talking about the idea of post-rock, because Earwig's fusion of minimalist classical styles, sampling, repetition, an interest in the texture of the music rather than in grabbing people with riffs and power chords, and this kind of melding of electronic and digital sounds with kind of standard rock or even classical instrumentation would ultimately come to be known as post-rock. And I think it's interesting that the first reference to the term post-rock comes from a review that Simon Reynolds was credited with writing about the band Bark Psychosis and their album Hex in 1994. But interestingly, he himself has said, actually, I used it in an earlier article. It was when I was writing in the Melody Maker about a band called Insides. Insides is the band that was formed from the ashes of Earwig when Dimitri left, leaving Kirsty and Julian as the sole members. So I think now is as good a time as any to introduce the idea of post-rock. I think with that in mind, you could almost make the case that Earwig were one of the very earliest of the 90s post-rock bands. So another track, Safe in My Hands, that, again, it has this minimalist air to it, which recalls some of the pop of the post-punk group Young Marble Giants, who were similarly entirely devoted to a minimalist approach to writing and creating music. But the Young Marble Giants were quite kind of playful and naive and quite funny. But Earwig sound deadly, deadly serious and very introspective, very melancholic. And I think here they kind of capture some of the feel of, I would say maybe some of the Cure's earliest records. I'm thinking things like 17 Seconds or Faith. That kind of very early, very minimal, deeply introspective kind of goth sound. The track Never Be Lonely Again slows things down massively, and this kind of almost prefigures what would come to be known as slowcore. There was a movement of bands in the mid-90s who really put the brakes on and slowed the music down to a snail's pace to try and kind of extract every ounce of tension and emotion out of it that they could. And I think there's a little of that at play here in Never Be Lonely Again. I think if you wanted to pick one track from this album to identify all the traits that I've been talking about with regards what would become post-rock, then I would take the track Scraped Out at the start of side 2. It uses this kind of sampled guitar harmonic riff, which is processed so that it almost sounds like gamelan. It's very odd. But then it weaves in these kind of very stabby, hiccuping offbeat rhythms. It layers up these samples of the electric guitar and the bass. It has this kind of beautiful sound which manages somehow the trick of being both repetitive and being based on these structures that repeat and loop and change, whilst having this bizarre unpredictability, this kind of almost avant kind of jazzy feel. It's pretty daring for the time, and it's certainly light years away from what was becoming this kind of spacey rock thing that shoegaze was beginning to turn into. Again, you hear these nagging circular motifs and structures repeating over and over, very much like the music of Philip Glass. You could take, for instance, the soundtrack to the movie Koyaanisqatsi would be a good place to start with that. Yeah, it's a really interesting sound, and I think this album needs to be heard a lot more. This sounds like music that was laboured over, that was sweated over, but it has this breathy, open, cool sound that is just unlike anything that the shoegaze bands had really been achieving up to that point. It's a really good record. So, sorry, bit of a long one again, but sometimes the music just, it needs explaining. You need to go into it a bit more. And this is kind of complex stuff, which I really like. Okay, you know the drill. There are some suggestions. I won't say any more. But I hopefully will see you for the next episode quite soon of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Bye for now.